My name is Claire. I am 24 years old, and on the night of my brother's graduation dinner, everything I believed about family collapsed. I had always been told that family meant unconditional love, that no matter what the people you lived with would be the ones to cheer you on the loudest. But that night, sitting at a table filled with relatives, clinking glasses, and cheerful laughter, I realized just how wrong I had been. My younger brother Kyle, 6 years my junior, had just managed to graduate high school with a record of C's and D's, barely enough to pass. My father stood up with a proud smile voice booming across the room and handed him a small black box. Kyle opened it, and inside lay a shiny key fob with the BMW logo gleaming under the light. A brand new car. A black BMW parked in our garage worth more than $40,000, handed to him as a reward for simply scraping by. I forced a smile. My cheeks burned as applause erupted around me. Everyone rose their voices thick with admiration for Kyle as though he had just conquered the impossible. I clapped too because that is what good daughters do, but inside my heart cracked. Then my father's eyes shifted to me, cold, detached. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded paper, and handed it to me across the table. I unfolded it, expecting maybe a note, perhaps even a small card. But no, it was an itemized bill, $900, rent, due on Sunday. I stared at the paper. My mind spun. Was this a cruel joke? For years I had pushed myself beyond every limit. I had graduated high school as valedictorian, secured a full scholarship, maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA, and worked part-time jobs just to cover my expenses. Yet, my father's message to me on this night meant for celebration was simple. You are an adult now. You pay to stay. The applause for Kyle's BMW still rang in my ears. My father's words cut through me with surgical precision. A car for him, a bill for me. That moment was more than unfairness. It was betrayal. I had always accepted the imbalance excused. It rationalized it, with the thought that maybe someday, my achievements would earn me his pride. But as I held that paper, my father's cold gaze drilling into me, I knew. No scholarship, no degree, no perfect record would ever be enough. Something inside me began to break loose. I thought of my rusty Honda bought secondhand with money I saved by juggling 3 jobs during college. I thought of the late nights studying in libraries, the meals skipped to save money, the quiet hope that someday my hard work would be noticed. And then I looked at Kyle, who sat grinning behind the wheel of a brand new BMW, basking in a glow of unconditional admiration. It was in that moment that I realized my life would change forever. That night wasn't simply about a car or a rent bill. It was the night I finally saw my family for what it was, a place where worth was not measured by character sacrifice or discipline, but by favoritism. And as I stared down at that piece of paper in my hand, something inside me whispered, "This is the beginning of the end." What? I sat frozen at that dinner table, the bill for $900 still clutched in my hand. Around me, relatives laughed and congratulated Kyle, their voices swelling with admiration for my younger brother. I tried to smile, tried to swallow the bitterness rising in my throat, but my chest tightened with every cheer. In that moment, I realized something painfully clear. My family had never truly seen me. Growing up, I had worked harder than anyone I knew. Straight A's, academic competitions, volunteer hours, scholarships. I had pushed myself because I believed it mattered, because I thought it would earn me the love and recognition I craved. Yet every milestone I reached was dismissed as expected. Meanwhile, Kyle could stumble his way through school and still be celebrated like a hero. That disparity was sharp tonight, sharper than ever before. I remember glancing at my mother's face. She hovered near Kyle, wiping tears from her eyes, as if he had just achieved something extraordinary. She looked at him the way I had always wished she would look at me, like he was the center of her universe. When her gaze flicked to me, it carried sympathy, not pride. It was as if she knew how unfair it all was, but chose silence over confrontation. And my father, Richard Wilson, stood tall-chested, puffed out a man who had built his contracting business from nothing and expected the world to admire his judgment. His judgment tonight that his son was worth a $40,000 car while his daughter was worth a bill. His voice still echoed in my ears colder than the night air because he's worth it. That sentence would replay in my mind for days, months, maybe even years. At that table, though, I swallowed my pain. I excused myself, slipped into the kitchen, and leaned against the counter just to breathe. My hands trembled as I looked at the paper. $900, due in 3 days. My mind raced. Rent in my parents' house was not about money. It was about control, about a final reminder that no matter how much I accomplished, I would never earn their approval. I pressed my palms against the cool countertop and stared at my reflection in the dark window. I asked myself, when will it be enough? The answer came quick and brutal never. And that truth lit a fire inside me. That night I understood something I should have seen long ago. Family is not always unconditional. Sometimes family places conditions so heavy that they suffocate you. And if you do not walk away, those conditions will break you down piece by piece until nothing is left. But I need to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever worked so hard only to realize your effort meant nothing to the people who were supposed to love you most? If you have, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and let's talk about it. And if my story already strikes something deep inside, you hit subscribe now because these stories matter and you're not alone in them. I returned to the dining room after a few minutes, carefully hiding the storm swirling inside me. Kyle was surrounded by cousins, everyone taking turns sitting in his new BMW, laughing, snapping photos. He looked radiant, innocent in his joy, and for a brief moment I felt no anger toward him. My frustration was never about Kyle. It was about the system my parents had built around us, one where his mediocrity was gold and my excellence was invisible. As the night wound down, I gathered plates and carried them to the kitchen. My mother touched my arm softly and whispered, "Don't be upset. Your father loves you in his own way." I forced a nod, but inside the words hollowed me out even further. Love in his own way had meant 24 years of being dismissed, overlooked, and left out. That night, after the last guest left and the laughter faded, my father cornered me once more in the kitchen. He reminded me, $900. Sunday, no excuses. He sipped his champagne like nothing he said mattered, like my future was just a financial transaction. I nodded slowly, but inside I had already decided. I would not be here on Sunday. Something had cracked open, and for the first time in my life, I was ready to walk through it. The house was silent after the party ended, but in my head the echoes of laughter still roared. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting across the room, replaying the same thought over and over. He gave Kyle a BMW, and he gave me a rent bill. It was not the first time I had been treated as less, but it was the first time the difference was so brutal, so undeniable, so public. I thought back to childhood when I would come home proudly, holding up a report card filled with straight A's. My father would barely glance at it before muttering, "That's what we expect from you." Minutes later, Kyle would wave a report card with C's, maybe a single B, and Dad would grin, pat him on the back, and say, "Great job, son. Let's go get ice cream." That double standard became the rhythm of our lives. My excellence was the baseline, his mediocrity was a triumph. When I became valedictorian in high school, the house was quiet. My mother baked a simple cake, and Dad did not even show up for the small gathering. Yet when Kyle got his first part-time job at the mall, my father threw him a celebratory dinner with steaks and dessert, raising a toast as if he had just landed a CEO position. I remember how much it stung sitting at the same table that night, hearing Dad say Kyle's finally becoming a man. I wanted to shout, "What about me? Am I invisible?" But I bit my tongue. I always did. It continued through college. When I was accepted to every graduate program, I applied for. My mother clapped politely, but Dad brushed it off with a warning about whether psychology was a practical path. Meanwhile, when Kyle got into a community college with average grades, they called the extended family, and went out for a celebratory steakhouse dinner. I cannot count how many times my achievements were downplayed. Last Christmas, Kyle got a gaming system worth hundreds of dollars because he managed to lift his grade in English from a D to a C minus. My gift, a planner with a note in Dad's handwriting to help you organize your goals. Every detail chipped away at me. Each time I told myself maybe Dad just connected differently, maybe he did not know how to show love. My Aunt Meredith once tried to comfort me by saying, "Your father struggles to connect with people who don't think like him." At the time, I wanted to believe her. But what does that even mean? That intelligence, ambition, and independence were flaws he could not tolerate. And still I stayed close to my family. I paid bills when something broke in the house. I helped with chores. I spent $100 a lot for me on Kyle's graduation gift because I wanted him to feel supported. I loved him even if my parents used him as the measure of my worth. But that night after the BMW reveal and the $900 rent demand, the truth snapped into focus. It had never been about balance. It had never been about showing love in different ways. It was favoritism, plain and simple. And I had been blind for too long. I lay there in the dark, and I asked myself a question that scared me. How long will you keep accepting this? How many more times will you let them dismiss you? That question would not leave me. It settled in my chest like a weight. And I realized the answer mattered more than anything else. But now I want to ask you, the one listening to my story. Have you ever been in that position, working harder, giving more, but always being valued less? How did you handle it? Share it in the comments, because your story might help someone else feel less alone. As the hours passed, sleep refused to come. I stared at the bill again, reading the cold numbers. $900. A demand from a father who had just spent $40,000 on a car for my brother. A demand from a man who had never celebrated a single one of my milestones. That night, lying awake, I finally admitted the truth to myself. If I stayed, it would never change. If I wanted freedom, if I wanted respect, I would have to step out of that house, out of that pattern, and never look back. It was terrifying, but in that terror there was also the faintest spark of hope. So, the morning after that graduation party, the house looked exactly the same, but to me it felt like a battlefield. I walked past the dining table where the night before my father had proudly presented Kyle's BMW keys. Empty glasses and crumpled napkins still lay scattered. The faint smell of apple pie lingered in the air. Yet what haunted me most wasn't the mess, it was the memory of my father's voice saying, "Because he's worth it." I tried to go about my day as if nothing had changed. I cleaned the kitchen folded laundry and watered the little herb garden on the windowsill. But every task felt heavy, like I was dragging chains. My mind kept flashing back to every moment in my life when I had been overlooked. When I was 16, I won a statewide academic competition. I brought home the medal shining and heavy around my neck. My father barely glanced at it before muttering, "Good job." The same night Kyle scored the winning point in his middle school basketball game, Dad lifted him onto his shoulders in front of the whole team, shouting, "That's my boy." When I was 21, I graduated college summa cum laude, a full-ride scholarship, and a perfect GPA. My father checked his watch throughout the ceremony. That evening we ate leftovers at the kitchen table, and he handed me a coffee mug with the words, "The real world starts now." Kyle, meanwhile, barely scraped by high school. Yet for him, there was steak dinners, balloons, and now a $40,000 car. As I scrubbed dishes that morning, I realized how much I had excused all of this. I had told myself for years that family is complicated, that maybe my father just didn't know how to express love, that maybe my mother's silence was her way of keeping peace. I clung to hope that someday, if I just worked harder, I would earn the approval I craved. But the truth, that hope was a cage. My father's bond with Kyle was built on sports cars and easy laughter. They spoke the same language. He never tried to speak mine. I was intellectual, curious, interested in psychology and helping people. He never saw value in that. My mother, though softer, was complicit. When I asked her once why Kyle was praised for everything while I was expected to be perfect, she sighed and said, Your father shows love differently. Kyle needs more encouragement than you do. I remember nodding at the time, but inside I felt the sting. I needed encouragement too. I needed to feel like someone was proud of me. Even Kyle himself seemed unaware of the favoritism. He came to me often for help with essays, advice about friends, or guidance on what classes to take. I never resented him. How could I? He didn't ask to be favored. If anything, I pitied him. The coddling he received would leave him unprepared for real adulthood. As I finished the last dish and set it in the rack, I caught my own reflection in the window. My eyes looked tired, but beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a kind of clarity I had never seen before. For years, I had been telling myself a story that if I endured, if I excelled, things would eventually balance out. But now that story was gone. I knew I had reached a breaking point. I could not keep sacrificing my own well-being to chase approval that would never come. My father would never look at me with the same pride he had for Kyle. My mother would never stand up to him on my behalf. The gap between what I gave and what I received was not shrinking, it was widening with every passing year. And so the question shifted. No longer, why doesn't he love me the way I want? But instead, why am I still here waiting for him to change? That shift was everything. I dried my hands and walked through the house. The family photos on the wall told a story that was only half true. Smiling faces, vacations, birthdays, all frozen moments meant to suggest harmony. But I knew the truth behind each picture. The silence, the unequal praise, the constant reminder that I was valued less. In that moment, I decided I would no longer live as a shadow in my own family. I didn't know yet how I would leave or where I would go. But I knew one thing: I could not keep living in a house where love felt conditional, where my worth was measured only against the glow of my brother's mediocrity. And for the first time, instead of despair, I felt a flicker of something new. Not just anger, not just sadness. Hope. The week after Kyle's graduation, I walked through the house like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Every room carried a memory I could no longer ignore. The living room where my father once praised Kyle for his part-time job while brushing off my promotion. The dining room where my Aunt Meredith raised her eyebrow at Christmas when Kyle unwrapped an expensive gaming system while I held a planner. Each corner whispered the same truth: I was never enough in this house. One evening I tried again to speak with my mother. She sat on the couch, grading her kindergarten students' drawings, red pen in hand. I asked her gently, "Mom, don't you see the difference in how Dad treats us? Don't you see how invisible I feel?" She paused, the pen hovering above a paper. "Your father shows love differently," she said softly. "Kyle needs more encouragement. You've always been self-sufficient." I wanted to scream. I need encouragement too. I need to be seen. But the words stuck in my throat. She meant well, but her silence, her willingness to let this favoritism thrive, cut deeper than any of Dad's dismissive remarks. That night I remembered something my Aunt Meredith once told me. Your father struggles to connect with people who don't think like him. It's not about love, it's about understanding. But standing in my room, staring at my medals and certificates stuffed into a dusty box, I realized it wasn't about understanding. It was about choice. My father chose to value Kyle. He chose to disregard me. And my mother chose not to fight it. Still, I tried to hold on. I kept helping Kyle with his community college essays. I kept paying for groceries, covering little expenses around the house, even though no one asked. Maybe part of me hoped that if I kept giving, they would finally notice me. But deep down, I knew the truth: giving more would never make them love me more. I remember the night I received a performance bonus at work. It wasn't much, but it meant recognition for my effort at the mental health clinic. I shared the news at dinner, waiting for even a small smile of pride. My father nodded once, then turned to Kyle and asked about his baseball game. Just like that, my achievement disappeared into silence. I laughed it off at the table, but inside something withered. I think back now to all those little moments that might seem small to outsiders, but when stacked together, they become unbearable. Like carrying a backpack where each pebble seems harmless until one day the weight crushes you. And that graduation night was the final stone. As I lay in bed replaying my father's words, because he's worth it, I understood that staying meant choosing to live under a shadow forever, and leaving meant risking everything, but finally being free. I want to pause here and speak directly to you listening. If you've ever felt overshadowed, if you've ever been told your hard work is just expected, while someone else is celebrated for less, know this, you are not invisible. And if you connect with my story, subscribe and join this community. Because here we see each other, we lift each other up. I did not know exactly what leaving would look like or where I would land. But in that moment, a seed was planted, a seed of courage. It whispered, "You deserve better." And once that seed was planted, I couldn't unhear it. That week, I started to imagine a life outside my parents' house. A life where I wasn't constantly compared, where my worth wasn't measured against someone else's failures or successes. A life where my achievements could simply be mine. The thought was terrifying, but it was also intoxicating. I knew something had to change. The tension in our house after the graduation party clung to the walls like smoke that refused to clear. Kyle spent his days polishing the BMW, taking short drives around the neighborhood, grinning like a boy who had finally been crowned king. My father hovered near him, giving advice on maintenance, bonding with him over horsepower and leather seats. I watched from the window, sometimes not out of jealousy for the car, but because their closeness was a constant reminder of what I never had. My father never taught me how to drive, never stood proudly at my side. After a victory, never looked at me with that same light in his eyes. Instead, he looked at me as if I were an employee in his company, reliable, efficient, but not remarkable. I thought about all the years I had convinced myself this was normal. Families were complicated, I told myself. Fathers and daughters didn't always connect, and mothers did what they could to hold things together. But after that rent bill landed in my hand, the curtain was pulled back. There was no more pretending. One night I overheard my parents talking in their bedroom. My mother's voice was hushed, almost pleading. "Richard, maybe 900 is too much. She's saving for graduate school." My father's response was sharp. "She's 24. She's an adult. If she wants to live here, she pays her share. Kyle just finished high school. He needs support right now. That's the difference." I stood frozen in the hallway, every word slicing through me. To him, I was not a daughter worth investing in. I was a tenant, an inconvenience. Later that evening, I sat with Kyle in the garage. He was scribbling in the leather-bound journal I had given him as a gift, the one I had spent nearly $100 on, money I really couldn't spare. He looked up and smiled. "Thanks again for this, Audrey. It means a lot." For a moment, my bitterness softened. He wasn't the enemy. He was just a boy caught in the middle of a storm he didn't even know existed. He had been raised in an environment where his smallest steps were celebrated. He didn't understand what it meant to fight for recognition. Still, I couldn't shake the ache in my chest. My generosity had always been unseen, swallowed up by a family dynamic that made Kyle the sun and me the shadow. That week, my best friend Jennifer sent me a text. "Remember, you don't have to stay there. You can always choose yourself." Her words replayed in my mind each time I walked past the BMW in the driveway. The car gleamed like a monument to everything I wasn't. I started to picture what leaving might look like. My savings weren't much, $20,000 scraped together by living frugally, skipping vacations, wearing thrift store clothes. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough for a deposit on an apartment. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. I had lived in that house my entire life. The walls carried my childhood drawings, the hallway bore the growth chart where my mother had marked our heights year after year. Walking away would mean leaving more than just favoritism behind. It would mean leaving the only home I had ever known. But staying meant suffocating. I realized that my father's words, "Because he's worth it," were not just about Kyle. They were about me too. They were his way of saying, "You are not." And that was something I could never accept again. I began quietly gathering important documents, my passport, my birth certificate, my college transcripts. I slipped them into a folder and tucked it into the back of my closet. It was the first physical step toward freedom. Each night as the house settled into silence, I would lie awake imagining my own space. A tiny studio maybe with secondhand furniture and thin walls. But it would be mine. No more bills disguised as punishment. No more waiting for applause that would never come. For the first time, the idea of leaving didn't feel like running away. It felt like survival. The confrontation I had been dreading came sooner than expected. It was late on a Thursday evening, and I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes when my father walked in. He loosened his tie, set down his empty glass, and without hesitation repeated the words that had been hanging over me like a guillotine. $900, due Sunday. He didn't say it with malice. He said it with the same tone he used when giving instructions to a worker on a job site, calm, absolute final. That made it even worse. I dried my hands and faced him. Dad, you just spent $40,000 on a car for Kyle. When I graduated college with honors, I got a coffee mug. Do you realize how that feels? His eyes narrowed. You're comparing apples and oranges. Kyle needs encouragement. You never did. I felt heat rising in my chest. So I'm punished for being self-sufficient. For never asking you for anything. He crossed his arms, jaw tightening. You're an adult now. Adults pay their way. Then why doesn't Kyle pay? He's 18. He can vote, join the military, sign contracts. He's old enough to be responsible too. My father's response was ice cold, because he's worth it. Those 4 words cut through me like a blade. I had suspected for years that this was how he saw us, but hearing it aloud made my knees weak. My throat burned with the urge to scream, but instead I whispered, You've always valued him more than me. He didn't deny it. He didn't rush to explain. He simply stood there stone-faced as if my pain was an inconvenience. My mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Richard, stop. You don't mean that. But I could see it in his eyes. He did mean it. That night lying in bed, I knew I could never undo those words. They would echo inside me for the rest of my life. I want to pause and ask you something, because maybe you've been here too. What's the cruelest sentence someone you love has ever spoken to you? A line that stuck in your chest like a shard of glass. Share it in the comments. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step toward healing. The house felt different after that. Every sound was sharper, every silence heavier. I moved through the rooms with the quiet resolve of someone preparing to leave. I started packing small things, clothes I didn't wear, often books I could live without for a while. I slid them into bags and tucked them into the back of my closet. Jennifer's text became my lifeline. You don't have to stay. Come crash here while you find a place. My couch is yours. At work, I forced smiles, but my coworkers noticed the tension in my shoulders. When my supervisor asked if I was all right, I muttered something about stress at home. She nodded kindly, but I could tell she saw through me. That Friday evening, Kyle bounded into the house full of excitement. Audrey, come check out the sound system. Dad says we'll drive to the lake next weekend. He was glowing, oblivious. I followed him outside, watched as he slid behind the wheel hands, tracing the steering wheel like it was a crown. Congrats, Kyle, I said softly. You really do deserve to be happy. And I meant it. My bitterness wasn't for him. It was for the father who had built an empire of favoritism. But as I stood there watching the car gleam under the porch light, I knew my time was up. Sunday would not arrive with me still in that house. The decision was made. That Saturday night, I sat on the edge of my bed with my laptop open, the glow, casting long shadows across the room. The weight of my father's words, because he's worth it, still pressed on me, but now it no longer crushed me. It fueled me. For the first time, I felt clarity. I would not be here when Sunday came. I opened my banking app. My balance, $20,000 saved from years of sacrifice. Enough for a deposit, maybe some secondhand furniture, and a few months of rent in a studio. It wasn't much, but it was freedom. Jennifer's text popped up again. I'm serious, Audrey. Come tonight. My couch is ready. Tears stung my eyes. It was the kind of unconditional support I had always longed for at home, and here it was from a friend. I typed back quickly, thank you. I might take you up on it. I glanced around my room. The walls were lined with memories, old report cards with excellent work scrawled across them. Medals from academic competitions, my valedictorian ribbon. I had held on to them for years, hoping they'd prove my worth someday. Tonight they looked like relics of a war I had fought alone. I pulled out 2 suitcases. Clothes went in first, folded fast and neat. Professional outfits for work, jeans and t-shirts for weekends. My laptop, important documents, and toiletries followed. Books were harder. I wanted to bring them all, but I chose only the ones that mattered most, novels that had carried me through lonely nights, and a few psychology texts I'd need for graduate school. Every item I packed felt like a declaration: I am leaving. I am choosing myself. At 3 in the morning, I stopped to breathe. My body ached, but my mind was sharp. I scribbled numbers on a notepad: rent ranges, utilities, estimated costs. I searched for apartments within 30 minutes of my job. The list was short, but it gave me hope. For a moment, fear clawed at me. What if I was making a mistake? What if I left and regretted it? What if I ended up alone, struggling, wishing I had stayed? But then I remembered the look in my father's eyes when he said those 4 words. That wasn't love I could grow under. That wasn't a place where I could thrive. The choice was no longer between leaving and staying. The choice was between freedom and suffocation. By dawn, my decision was final. I drafted a letter, rewriting it several times before it felt right. Mom, Dad, Kyle, I've decided it's time for me to live independently. Dad, you're right, I'm an adult and adults should pay their way, so I will, just not here. Mom, I love you. Kyle, none of this is your fault. I'm proud of you and I always will be. This is between me and our parents. Please take care of yourself and enjoy your new car. I'll be in touch when I'm settled. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into an envelope. On the front, I wrote one word: family. At breakfast, I acted normal. I poured coffee, made small talk, and laughed at Kyle's excitement over plans to drive to the lake. My father barely looked at me. My mother's smile seemed forced, her eyes flicking toward me as though she could sense the shift. But I kept my secret close. When they left for the test drive, the house fell quiet. I walked to the refrigerator, placed the envelope beneath a small Eiffel Tower magnet, and stood there for a long moment. My throat tightened, but I refused to cry. I grabbed my suitcases, rolled them down the hall, and paused at the front door. The height chart on the pantry wall caught my eye, scribbled lines marking me at ages 6, 10, 15. Kyle's marks rose alongside mine. For a second, I felt a wave of grief. This had been my home, even with all its flaws. But grief gave way to something stronger: resolve. I whispered goodbye, turned the knob, and stepped into the sunlight. My car was packed and waiting. As I slid behind the wheel, I felt a strange lightness, like chains falling away. For the first time in 24 years, I was no longer waiting for my father's approval. I was writing my own story. Driving away from the house that morning felt unreal. The streets I had traveled my whole life looked different, as though I were seeing them through a new lens. For the first time, they weren't leading me home, they were carrying me toward freedom. My car was old, the same beat-up Honda I had bought with money from 3 part-time jobs during college. The air conditioner rattled the check engine, light glowed faintly, but I didn't care. That car had been mine, every mile earned through sweat. Unlike the BMW gleaming in my parents' driveway, this vehicle represented survival and independence. I pulled into Jennifer's apartment complex and parked. She met me at the door with open arms and no questions. "Stay as long as you need," she said simply, showing me the air mattress she had set up in her living room. Closet space cleared and the fridge stocked with my favorite snacks. Her kindness was overwhelming. I had grown up believing love was conditional, that it had to be earned. Yet here was proof that true love, platonic, loyal, steady, asked for nothing in return. That evening, my phone began buzzing nonstop. Kyle's name lit up the screen again and again. "Audrey, where are you? Please come home." Mom's crying. Dad is furious. I responded, "Only once I'm safe. I need space. I'll explain later." My mother called 14 times, each voicemail swinging from sobbing pleas to angry accusations. My father's messages were cold, a text calling my exit childish, followed by a voicemail reminding me that adults have responsibilities, and finally an email, stating I had until the end of the month to remove the rest of my belongings, or they would be disposed of appropriately. Not once did he ask if I was okay. Reading his words confirmed everything I had feared, but also everything I needed. Leaving had been the right choice. Still doubt crept in late at night. I lay awake on Jennifer's couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering, what now? How do I build a life on my own? Will my family ever forgive me? Will I ever forgive them? But here's the thing, I had already taken the first step. I had left. And sometimes leaving is the bravest, hardest, and most necessary thing you can do. And now I want to open a loop for you listening. Because this is where the story shifts, where consequences ripple in ways none of us expect. What do you think happens when the overlooked daughter finally chooses herself? Do you think my family will crumble, or will this break force them to finally see the truth? Share your thoughts below. I'm curious how you imagine the next chapter. The following days were a blur of small victories and private tears. Jennifer helped me browse apartment listings. Most were tiny, overpriced, or already taken, but one stood out: a studio in a converted Victorian house 30 minutes from my job. The landlady, Mrs. Chen, was warm and kind, more interested in finding responsible tenants than squeezing rent from them. When I explained vaguely that I had moved out suddenly, she smiled knowingly and said, "Sometimes family is the reason we need our own space." I signed the lease that week. At the clinic, I carried on as usual, greeting patients, scheduling intakes, balancing paperwork. But inside, I was different. I wasn't just an employee saving for graduate school anymore. I was a woman rebuilding her life from the ground up. That Friday night, Jennifer dragged me out for happy hour with her coworkers. I laughed for the first time in weeks, sipping cocktails and listening to stories about office politics I had no stake in. It reminded me there was a bigger world outside my family's dysfunction. A world where I could belong, not because I was worth it to someone else, but because I was me. And then out of nowhere, hope arrived in the form of an email from my old professor, Dr. Hanson Audrey. "Congratulations on your graduate school acceptance. I'm leading a research project on trauma-informed care. It comes with tuition reimbursement and a part-time RA position. Would you be interested?" My heart soared. Not only would this lighten the financial load, but it would also give me real experience in the field I loved. It was the validation my father had never given me, arriving from someone who actually understood my path. That night, lying on Jennifer's couch, I allowed myself a small smile. My life was still in pieces, but slowly I was gathering them into something new. The note I had left behind had closed one door, but it had also opened another. The first week at Jennifer's apartment was a blur of emotions: relief, fear, grief, and underneath it all, a strange new strength I hadn't known I possessed. Every night when the apartment grew quiet, I scrolled through Kyle's unanswered messages. "Please come home. Everyone is falling apart. Mom won't stop crying." His words pierced me. I loved my brother, but I couldn't go back, not after what Dad had said. One evening, my Aunt Meredith called. Her voice carried that familiar mix of blunt honesty and reluctant compassion. "Your mom is devastated. Your father is stomping around like a wounded bull." "What happened, Audrey?" "All I know is you and Richard fought about rent." For a moment I hesitated. Should I soften the truth? But then I remembered how easily the truth had been buried in my family, how silence had become the weapon that kept me invisible. So I told her. I told her about the BMW, the $900 rent, and my father's words, "because he's worth it." There was a long pause on the line. Then Meredith sighed heavily. He said that out loud. "Yes." "Oh, Richard," she muttered. "He always was an idiot with words." "But Audrey, you need to know it's not you. You've always intimidated him. You remind him of his mother. Smart, independent questioning. He doesn't know how to handle that." Her words brought me a flicker of validation, but also sadness. For years, I had twisted myself into knots, trying to become someone he could love. And all along, he had been threatened by who I naturally was. That night, I stared at the ceiling in Jennifer's living room, and a question kept looping in my mind. How many of us are punished not for our failures, but for our strengths? I wonder, have you ever felt like the very things that make you unique, the things you're proud of, are the same things someone close to you resents? If so, what did you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. I really want to know, because maybe your story will help someone else realize they aren't alone. The days passed quickly. I poured myself into work at the clinic, grateful for the distraction. But the nights were harder. The silence left too much room for doubt. Then came another blow. My father emailed me again. His words were curt, clinical. Your belongings must be removed by the end of the month, or they will be discarded. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't ask where I was living. He didn't ask if I needed anything. It was as though I had ceased to exist, reduced to a deadline, and a list of items to be thrown away. I stared at the email for a long time before closing my laptop. It was confirmation of what I already knew. His love had always been conditional, and now it was gone altogether. But instead of breaking me, that realization set me free. Because if his approval was never mine to begin with, why had I spent so many years chasing it? With Jennifer's encouragement, I toured apartments during lunch breaks. Most were either too expensive or in poor condition. But when I stepped into the small studio owned by Mrs. Chen, I felt something shift. The hardwood floors were scratched, the walls plain, but the space was warm. It was quiet. It was mine. Mrs. Chen looked at me with kind eyes. Sometimes family is the reason we need our own place, she said. And in that moment, I felt understood in a way I never had at home. I signed the lease the next day. When I held the keys in my hand, my chest tightened. Fear and excitement mixed until I could hardly tell them apart. But one thing was clear: I was done being invisible. And I was ready for whatever came next. Today. The day I moved into my studio apartment, the air felt lighter, sharper, almost electric. Jennifer and 2 co-workers helped me load everything into their pickup truck. We hauled my suitcases, boxes of books, a second-hand couch I had found online, and a mismatched set of dishes Jennifer had insisted I take. When the last box was carried up the narrow staircase, I stood in the middle of the room and looked around. The space was small, just one room, with a kitchenette tucked into a corner, a bathroom with a door that creaked, and a single window overlooking the street. But it was mine. Every corner, every inch, belonged to me. I dropped onto the couch, exhausted but buzzing with adrenaline. "You did it!" Jennifer grinned, handing me a slice of pizza. "You're free." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Free. I hadn't realized how heavy my old house had felt until I stepped into this place and could breathe without waiting for someone else's judgment. That first night, I unpacked, slowly savoring the process. Clothes in the small closet, books stacked carefully on a shelf, my laptop on the desk by the window. I lit a cheap candle and watched the flame flicker, a tiny symbol of warmth in my new beginning. Still as the hours passed and the others left, silence crept in. No voices in the hallway, no sound of my mother flipping through magazines, no rumble of my father's footsteps. Just me in a space that was both liberating and terrifying. For a moment, I almost broke. Loneliness surged, whispering that maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I should have endured the unfairness just to avoid this emptiness. I curled up on the couch, staring at the bare ceiling, fighting tears. But then my phone buzzed. A new email from Dr. Hansen, my old professor. "Audrey, I'm leading a new research project on trauma-informed care. We're looking for an assistant. The position comes with tuition reimbursement and part-time pay. Would you be interested?" I reread it 3 times, hardly believing the timing. It felt like the universe had caught me mid-fall and placed a hand beneath me. I replied immediately, "Yes, absolutely yes." The next morning, I dressed carefully and met Dr. Hansen for coffee to discuss the position. He spoke with genuine excitement about the research about giving students real experience in the field. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt seen not as someone who had to prove herself, but as someone whose abilities were already recognized. Walking back to my apartment, I realized something important. My father had spent years telling me my career choice wasn't practical, that counseling wasn't real work. Yet here I was being offered a role that validated everything I had fought for. His voice was no longer the one that mattered. That weekend, I settled fully into my apartment. I hung pictures of me and Jennifer on hikes, framed my college diploma, and placed a small plant on the windowsill. Each detail turned the room from a shelter into a home. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't the daughter begging for scraps of approval. She was building her own life. But freedom is never without cost. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from Kyle, increasingly frantic. "Why did you leave?" "Is it because of me? Dad's furious. Mom won't stop crying." Each text broke me a little. I reassured him, "This isn't your fault. I love you. I'll explain when we meet." And I meant it. My fight was not with him. My fight was with the patterns that had kept us trapped. One evening, I stood at the window watching the city lights flicker. I whispered to myself, "This is only the beginning." For the first time, those words didn't scare me. They thrilled me. 6 months passed faster than I could have imagined. Life in my little studio became routine. I woke early, brewed cheap coffee in my thrift store pot, and walked to the clinic where I balanced intake forms and the quiet desperation of strangers seeking help. In the evenings, I studied for graduate school, my desk piled with psychology texts while a single lamp lit the room. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Dr. Hansen's research assistant position became more than just a job. It was a lifeline. Each time I contributed to the project, every time my ideas were acknowledged, I felt layers of invisibility peeling away. Recognition here was not conditional. It was earned, real, and deeply satisfying. But even as my professional world grew, my family ties frayed. My father never reached out except for curt transactional emails. Remove your belongings, send updated address for mail, no warmth, no curiosity. My mother's weekly calls were gentler but careful. She asked about my work, my apartment, but never acknowledged why I had left. She carried a guilt she never spoke aloud, and I carried the ache of knowing she still chose silence. Kyle was different. He texted constantly small updates about classes, his car, his frustration with Dad's expectations. One message stuck with me. Sometimes I feel like my life was decided before I even got to live it. His words reminded me of my own at his age. It hurt to see him walking the same tightrope I had once stumbled across. Then one evening in November, there was a knock at my door. I expected a neighbor borrowing sugar, but when I opened it, my parents stood there. My mother clutched her purse like a lifeline, eyes nervous. My father stood behind her shoulders, stiff expression unreadable. My pulse hammered. For 6 months I had lived with the quiet certainty that they would not come. Yet here they were in my tiny apartment, breathing the same air that had become my sanctuary. "May we come in?" my mother asked softly. I hesitated, then stepped aside. "Sure, I was just making dinner." They looked around as they entered. My father's eyes flicked over the second-hand furniture, the IKEA shelves, the small details that screamed modest. My mother lingered on the framed photos of me with Jennifer and co-workers' images of a life they had no part in. "It's cozy," she said, forcing a smile. "It suits me," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart raced. We sat, them on the couch, me in the armchair. The silence was thick, broken only when my father cleared his throat. "Your brother's struggling," he said at last. My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "He's talking about dropping out of college," my mother added quickly, her voice tinged with worry. "He's withdrawn. His grades are slipping." Shock rippled through me. Just days earlier, Kyle had proudly shown me an A- on an essay. He hadn't mentioned wanting to quit. "We thought," my father said carefully, "maybe you could talk to him. He listens to you." I studied their faces, looking for cracks. My mother's eyes were pleading. My father's, though, carried something unfamiliar, uncertainty. For the first time, I sensed he was not in control, and in that moment, I realized my leaving had shifted something in their world. Without me there to shoulder the weight, the cracks in their treatment of Kyle were beginning to show. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because what happened next, the conversation that unfolded in that cramped apartment, changed the way I saw not only my father, but myself. And if you think the favoritism was over, you're wrong. This was only the beginning of a twist I never expected. So, before I tell you, I want to ask, what would you have done in my place? If the family who broke you came to your door asking for help, would you open it, or would you finally close it for good? Share your answer below, I want to know. The air in that room was thick with unspoken history. My father shifted uncomfortably, my mother's hands trembled, and I sat waiting for the truth to finally spill. And it did. The silence stretched so long that I thought my father might stand up and leave. But then, to my surprise, he looked me straight in the eye. I said things that night I shouldn't have, he muttered, voice lower than I'd ever heard it. My stomach nodded. He wasn't a man who admitted mistakes, not even small ones. I waited, unsure if this was the beginning of an apology or just another excuse. He cleared his throat. Your mother tells me I've been uneven with you and Kyle. Maybe she's right. I expected more from you and gave you less recognition. It wasn't fair. The words hung in the air, fragile and incomplete. Part of me wanted to scream that uneven didn't begin to cover 24 years of favoritism. But another part of me, the exhausted part, simply noted how strange it was to hear him admit anything at all. I won't move back, I said quietly. That's not an option. But if you want to rebuild something, it has to be on new terms, boundaries, respect. My mother reached for my hand, tears glistening. That's all we're asking for, just a chance to try again. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in my father's face. He wasn't the unshakable authority figure anymore. He looked like a man who wasn't sure how to keep his family together. And maybe that was the power I had gained by leaving, forcing him to see that his control wasn't absolute. A week later, Kyle and I met at a coffee shop. His face was tired, his energy dimmer. Are you really not coming back? He asked immediately. No, I said firmly, but I'll always be here for you. He stirred his drink eyes downcast. Dad keeps pushing business classes, wants me to take over the company someday. But what if that's not what I want? I leaned forward. Then you have to decide for yourself. I can't tell you what to choose, and neither can he. But you have the right to figure it out. Kyle nodded slowly, the weight of my words sinking in. For the first time, I saw him questioning the path laid out for him, the same path I had been forced to walk until I broke free. Later that night, I thought about how much had changed since I left. My apartment might be small, my furniture secondhand, but it was the place where I found my voice. The place where I realized I didn't need permission to live my own life. And here's something I want to say directly to you. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt trapped by family expectations, remember this. You are allowed to draw lines. You are allowed to demand respect. And if my story resonates with you, subscribe and join this community. Because here we tell the truth about family and we build strength together. The next months became a series of cautious steps forward. My father didn't change overnight, but he did start asking questions about my graduate program. He even sent a short email congratulating me when a paper I co-authored was published. Awkward, formal, but progress nonetheless. My mother softened, too, treating me less like a child who needed to be managed, and more like a woman who had earned her independence. Our lunches together became real conversations, not polite small talk. Kyle, though, was the biggest change. He began pushing back gently against Dad, negotiating compromises instead of blindly obeying. He still loved the BMW, still enjoyed his privileges, but now he questioned what those privileges cost. And I realized something powerful by leaving. I hadn't just freed myself. I had shifted the entire family dynamic. The girl who once felt invisible had become the one everyone turned to. By the time a full year had passed since I left my parents' house, the ground beneath our family had shifted in ways I never thought possible. Kyle called me more often than ever. At first, his messages were frantic. What should I do about Dad, or how do I tell him I don't want this? But gradually his words began to change. He was no longer asking for step-by-step instructions. He was reflecting, questioning, making choices for himself. One night over coffee, he admitted, "Sometimes I feel like I'm living Dad's life, not mine. He wants me to take over the company, marry someone he approves of, live in the suburbs. But what if I want something else?" I looked at him and smiled sadly. "Then you have to fight for it, Kyle. It won't be easy, but it's your life." For the first time, I saw him understand that truth. He wasn't the clueless younger brother anymore. He was a young man wrestling with the same invisible chains that had once bound me. My father struggled the most with these changes. At dinners, he would launch into lectures about hard work and legacy, only to be interrupted by Kyle saying calmly, "That's your dream, Dad, not mine." Each time my father's face darkened, but he said less than he used to. Perhaps because he realized the louder he pushed, the further we pulled away. My mother became the bridge. She started meeting me for lunch every other week. We laughed about silly things, talked about her students, and sometimes dipped into deeper waters. One afternoon, over grilled cheese sandwiches, she admitted I should have defended you more. "I thought you didn't need it because you were strong, but I see now. Even strong daughters need to hear they're loved." The words hit me harder than I expected. I had carried so much resentment toward her silence, yet hearing her admit that mistake cracked something open inside me. It wasn't a full repair, but it was a start. Meanwhile, I thrived in graduate school. My research work gave me confidence, and my small apartment grew into a home. I discovered joy in photography, filled my weekends with hikes, and learned the beauty of solitude. No longer was I the daughter waiting for recognition. I was a woman building a life that reflected me. Still, there were moments of backsliding. Holidays were awkward. At Thanksgiving, Dad slipped into old habits, praising Kyle's natural leadership, while ignoring the fact that my research paper had just been published. My jaw clenched, but instead of crumbling, I reminded myself, his silence doesn't erase my worth. Later that evening, Kyle surprised me by interrupting Dad. "Actually, Audrey's paper is incredible. You should be proud, Dad." The table went quiet. My father cleared his throat and muttered, "Yes, of course. Good work." It wasn't much, but coming from him, it was monumental. These moments taught me that change was never instant. It was slow, jagged, and uneven, but it was happening. I realized something else, too. Leaving hadn't destroyed my family. It had reshaped it. Without me in the house, they had to face the void I left behind. My absence forced conversations, forced recognition, forced growth. One evening, I stood in my apartment packing a small bag to help Kyle move into his own place near campus. As we carried boxes together, he turned to me and said quietly, "If you hadn't left, I don't think I ever would have questioned anything. You showed me it was possible." His words brought tears to my eyes. I hadn't just saved myself. I had opened a door for him too. And in that moment, I understood something powerful. Sometimes walking away isn't abandonment. Sometimes it's the most radical form of love. The following year marked the true turning point. I had settled into my one-bedroom apartment, earned a steady rhythm with graduate school, and was even dating Nathan, a fellow student who showed me what genuine partnership looked like. Life outside my parents' house was no longer survival, it was growth. But what surprised me most was how the family I'd walked away from slowly began to walk toward me. Kyle invited me to his new apartment, a modest space he paid for with scholarships and part-time work. As we assembled a bookshelf together, he looked up and said, "You changed everything, Audrey. Not just for you, but for me too." I froze the screwdriver in my hand, heavy. If you hadn't left, I'd still be living on autopilot. Now I see I get to choose. Hearing that made every tear, every sleepless night worth it. My brother was carving his own path, not just following our father's blueprint. My mother's transformation was quieter. She no longer tried to smooth things over with platitudes. At lunch one afternoon, she admitted I stayed silent too long. I thought I was protecting peace, but really I was protecting comfort. "And I'm sorry." I didn't say anything right away, but I reached across the table and held her hand. That gesture said enough. My father, though, he remained the hardest. Old habits clung to him like armor, but small cracks showed. He began asking brief but genuine questions about my studies. He even sent a stiff email when I was published in Dr. Hansen's journal article. "Congratulations on the paper. Well done." It wasn't effusive, but from him it felt seismic. A year after I left, I hosted my first dinner party in my apartment. It was cramped chairs borrowed from neighbors, mismatched plates, but it was mine. Jennifer laughed with Kyle, my mother helped me serve dessert, and even my father engaged in polite conversation with Dr. Hansen about practical applications of psychology. Watching them all in my little space, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't. The scars of favoritism and neglect don't vanish overnight. But because the power dynamic had shifted, I was no longer the overlooked daughter waiting desperately for a crumb of recognition. I was an adult standing on my own ground, choosing who entered my life and on what terms. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes we think leaving is an ending, but leaving that night with a note on the fridge and 2 suitcases in my trunk wasn't an end. It was a beginning. A beginning that gave me freedom, forced my family to grow, and showed Kyle that he could live differently too. If you've stayed with me this far, then you know the truth. Walking away from what diminishes you is not selfish. It is survival. and sometimes it's the only way to create space for something better to bloom. But here's where I'll leave you with a thought. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed paying $900 in rent under the same roof as a father who gave your brother a BMW? Or would you have walked out and never looked back? Comment below, I want to hear your take. And if this story resonates, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Because the next story I'm about to share will take this idea of breaking free to a whole new level. As I blew out the candles after that dinner party, the room filled with laughter fading into the night, I whispered a promise to myself. Never again will I settle for being invisible. I had chosen myself, and that choice changed everything. Looking back now, I see that night, the night of Kyle's graduation, not as the moment everything broke, but as the moment everything began. At the time, it felt like betrayal, like my father's words would echo in me forever because he's worth it. But what those words really did was set me free. Leaving wasn't easy. I grieved the family I wished I had, the parents I longed for, and the home I thought would always shelter me. But once I stepped outside that door, I realized something powerful worth is not given by others. It is chosen, claimed, and lived by yourself. Today my life is not perfect, but it is mine. My apartment may be small, but it holds laughter books, friendships, and a sense of belonging. I never felt in my parents' house. My career is demanding, but every step reminds me that my path matters, even if it isn't the one my father would have chosen. And my relationships, though complicated, are now built on honesty rather than silence. If there's one lesson I want you to take from my story, it's this. Sometimes the bravest act of love you can give yourself is to walk away, not to punish, not to abandon, but to protect the parts of you that are still growing. Because when you choose yourself, you open the door for everything else, healing, freedom, and even reconciliation to follow. And maybe that choice can inspire someone else too.